Good afternoon, everyone. The conference is nearing its end. I am Leonie Diaz-Gonzalez. I am a rising senior here at FIU studying international relations. I am also an FIU junior analyst with the Jack D. Gordon Institute Security Research Hub, SRH. SRH is a virtual platform that leverages publicly available information to foster collaboration and enhance understanding of security issues in Latin America and the Caribbean. Through partnerships with academic institutions, NGOs, and government agencies, the SRH provides access to research, repositories, dashboards, and resources to help innovative policy approaches to address security challenges. This breakout session will be about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And shameless plug, SRH has an IUU research dashboard that might be worth checking out after this panel. And with that, it is my honor to introduce Mark Bond, the research assistant professor with the FIU Institute of Environment, which will be the moderator for this session. Kathy Dalton, DWF Senior Program Manager for Conservation International. Sam McGovern, a portfolio manager for C4ADS. Greg Cassad, Senior Compliance Advisor at Wild Aid. And finally, but not least, Gina Floor, the global campaign advisor for the Coalition of Fishery Transparency. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this critical discussion on IUU, which is illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. Obviously, we're running a little short on time, so I'm not going to go into introducing our very esteemed panel in more detail. The bios are online, but we have a mixed bag of former government experience and now civil society, and we're looking forward to a very fruitful discussion. But our main focus on this is to kind of highlight some of the main aspects of IUU fishing, and really we want to hear back from you and have like a dynamic Q&A session. So globally, IUU fishing is one of the most pressing security threats, firstly to marine ecosystems, where it undermines sustainable fisheries and threatens the food security for millions of people. It can contribute to the collapse of fish stocks, it can endanger marine biodiversity, and disadvantages law-abiding fishers. The consequences can extend far beyond the ocean, fueling transnational crime, which we've heard a lot about today, and weakening coastal economies and governance and threats to national security. You can tell the importance of IUU fishing on the global scale, given the fact that it was mentioned earlier by the Minister of Defense from Argentina, and yesterday by Admiral Halsey. To give you a sense of the scale, it's estimated that IUU fishing costs the global economy between $15 and $36 billion with a B, per year, and makes up about 20% of the fish that are landed in Latin America are sourced from IUU fishing. As I've already introduced, my name is Dr. Mark Bond, and I'm very excited to moderate this panel. And with that, I will hand over to Katy to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you, everyone. I know this is the end of 2 long days, and so really honored to have you all here in the room to close out the conference to talk about fish. And thanks, Mark and Bruce, for organizing this panel and for the invitation. So the panel is obviously about IUU fishing, which Mark just talked about a little bit, but within that, I would like to specifically talk to you about the impact of distant water fleets. There we go. Distant water fleets are often associated with IUU fishing, and so they're a really important part of this conversation. And specifically, I want to use the jumbo flying squid fishery off the coast of Peru in the Pacific as a case study to explore this. But before I dive into that, I want to just give a brief overview of distant water fishing for those of you who may not think about this issue every day. So distant water fishing is generally defined as fleets or vessels that fish either within the 200 nautical miles or the exclusive economic zone, EEZ, of a country that is different from that of their country of origin, or on the high seas, where no single country has jurisdiction. These fleets are often operating far from their home ports, and they might have crew and captains and owners who are all from different countries. and then they're fishing across many different jurisdictions a lot of the time. And that's not to mention all of the various support networks and enabling factors and that are provisioning and supporting these fleets that some of my fellow panelists will go into more detail about. But this is just to say that this entire sector is kind of in its own league in terms of its economic and geopolitical system that it's operating within, and it has many, many layers of fragmented law and policy that make it really difficult to study, let alone effectively regulate. Why does this exist? Why is this a problem? Why are we talking about it? Over the past 50 years, global demand for seafood has more than doubled. And so as a result, countries and companies, specifically with the means to, have been driven or incentivized to exploit fish stocks further and further from their home waters, which they may have already exhausted their fish stock supply. And fishing farther away is more expensive and it's more complicated. And so that brings in all of this wide variety of factors that you see on this screen. And this is not comprehensive by any means, but this is just to sort of illustrate that there is not one single type of distant water fishing. There's not one way to characterize it that's correct or incorrect. It's really variable, and the impacts that it has vary a lot depending on the context, on the geopolitics, on the environment, on the history, on social factors, some of which you can see in this figure. So with that in mind, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about a story about the fishery in Peru. So jumbo flying squid, or pota in Spanish, is a massively important fishery, both in terms of employment, in terms of livelihoods, and economic output for the country. The national fishery is entirely comprised of artisanal, semi-industrial vessels. And these vessels are taking trips that are maybe a couple of days up to a couple of weeks long. And that average time of trip length of their time at sea is increasing over the past couple of years, we've heard, and this is because of resource competition as well as rising demand. Jumbo flying squid, also just to put this in context, this fishery, this artisanal fishery, is one of the 3 largest artisanal fisheries in the world. So this is we're not talking about tiny vessels that are just fishing a couple of times a year. This is a really big, really important sector. Now there is no foreign fishing permitted within Peru's national waters. So, but these Peruvian vessels will exit Peru's jurisdiction. They will go beyond 200 nautical miles and fish on the high seas, where they are sharing fishing space with foreign fleets. And when they go beyond those 200 nautical miles, they are in an area that is managed by the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization, or RFMO, because that is a mouthful. And that's the intergovernmental management body that is in charge of managing fish stocks within this region on the high seas. And on the high seas in this area, the artisanal fleets are directly competing with these vessels that you can see here, the disparity in terms of not only size, but also level of mechanization, how many crew would be on board, the type of gear that they're using. So despite the fact that these vessels are so much smaller, Peru has actually been the leading country catching squid over the last, this graph shows catches since the year 2000 up until 2020, and the purple line is Peru. So this artisanal fleet, again, just to underscore how much this fleet is catching, they, up until 2022, when China actually surpassed them for the first time in terms of jumbo flying squid catches. But that peak in 2019 is over 500,000 tons of squid, and that equates to $850 million in exports. So really significant, and the vast majority of that is going to China. Now, these distant water fleets are really reliant on support networks that I mentioned to not have to go into port as often. But they still have to occasionally for things like maintenance, or increasingly we're seeing going to port for disembarking injured or sick, or unfortunately deceased crew members. And of note, when these vessels are coming to port, they are not offloading catch. The catch from the distant water fleets is not being processed in Peru. Peru isn't capturing any of that value. But ports are a critical point in any seafood supply chain, as I'm sure many of you know, in a lot of supply chains, like we heard on the panel yesterday. But they're especially important when it comes to interrupting illegal or illicit activity. And so when a vessel is in port, it's actually one of the few times when a country other than the flag state of that vessel has any jurisdiction or authority over that vessel. So when a Chinese distant water vessel is in port in Peru, Peru actually has the ability to leverage some control over that vessel. And so that is why many of you may have heard of the Port State Measures Agreement, which is a global agreement that's really widely ratified, most recently by China, which is great news. And it sets out standards and requirements for foreign vessels to access ports, specifically to prevent IUU fishing. So in Peru, in the past, around like 2020, 2022 timeframe, there were reports showing that distant water vessels were shutting down their monitoring systems, either when they were really close to the Peruvian waters, or after using ports on their way back out to the high seas. And so Peru, noting this and being a signatory to the PSMA, they, under the Port State Measures Agreement, put into place some regulations that required foreign vessels to use a specific vessel monitoring system that is compatible with Peruvian systems in order to be able to access their port services. And this initially led to a really steep decline in port visits by foreign vessels in Peru. And then we slowly started seeing the port visits climb back up again, and unfortunately that increase did not coincide with actual compliance with that measure. So we could talk about these issues, these challenges all day and all of the problems, but I want to take a minute to talk about solutions also, and particularly solutions for coastal states like Peru, in situations where they're dealing with distant water fishing nations and there might be a significant power imbalance. So I want to take a step back and think about what the pillars of fisheries management are, and what are some of the tools that we have at our disposal. And I like to think of this, and bear with me, I know this is simplistic, but I like to think of this as a three-legged stool. And the first leg is the science. And this is understanding the stock that you're fishing, the resource that you're extracting from the ocean, and how much you can catch in order to continue to be able to fish. The other is the policy. That's the regulation that tells you when and where and how and who can fish, right? That's based on that science. And then there's the third leg, which is the monitoring, the control, surveillance, and enforcement, which tells you, okay, how much was actually caught, the nature of the fishing activity, were the rules followed, and if not, how can we follow through on enforcement actions? And all of that info then feeds back to the science. And you need all three of these pillars to be talking to each other in order for fisheries management to be successful. And obviously this is pretty simplified way of thinking about fisheries, and it's obviously more complex than this, especially when it comes to distant water fleets. But if we apply this framework in thinking about Peru specifically and the management of the squid fleet, we can come up with a few targeted solutions. So for the science, we need to know more about the squid stock. It's pretty understudied. We need to know more about its ecology, particularly how it will be impacted by climate change. We need research into the socioeconomic impacts of the distant water fleets, even fishing on the high seas, how they're impacting coastal communities and Peruvian fishers and their livelihoods. For policy, we need regulation that is directly responsive to that science, right? We need equitable management measures in the Regional Fisheries Management Organization. We need to register the vessels that are fishing beyond 200 nautical miles in the RFMO. We need strong port regulations. We need alignment with international instruments. I could go on and on. But really critical to the success of the policy measures in particular is capacity building. And that's been mentioned a few times over the last couple of days. And I think that particularly for governments to engage in these processes, that is a big need. And not just capacity building, but also collaboration between governments, within governments, and also between governments and civil society and industry, really collaborating and working together. And then finally, we need that monitoring, control, and surveillance. We need the data that is collected. First, we need the data to be collected, right? And then that data needs to be shared. It needs to be accessible, and we need that transparency to know what's really happening at sea, what's being caught, and for that data to then directly go back and inform our science. And these legs are all mutually reinforcing each other, and if one fails, the whole stool collapses, right? And this, I think you can apply a similar sort of framework in thinking about IUU fishing as well. But yeah, I just want to underscore that I think sort of you could imagine the top of the stool as transparency, that is one of the things that's really holding all three of these together. So I will stop there and hand it over to Sam.
Thank you, Katy. Thank you to FIU, thank you to Bruce especially, and Mark, La Fundación Taera as well, and it's a pleasure to be here and been learning a lot in the last couple of days. This is kind of a newer field for me with more hard security stuff, but it's been interesting to hear all the overlap amongst kind of fisheries and fisheries security and more broad security topics. So Katy outlined distant water fishing and the challenges and kind of the problems and why they persist extremely well, sorry. Historically, we've kind of gone after IUU fishing, and when I say IUU, I'm also going to mean kind of more broad labor practices and human rights issues that persist on these distant water fleets. We've gone after it as a vessel-by-vessel level type of enforcement. But what we've seen over time is that these fleets, if we look at them as a whole, under the same ownership structures, we see that they have similar operating patterns. So you often see similar risks within those fleets of interests, whether it's gaps in their AIS data or their tracking data, whether it's indicators of forced labor, whether it's instances of illegal catching or gear use, whatever it may be. So our approach at C4ADS is to look at these a little bit zoomed out and look at these as fleets connected by ultimate beneficial ownership. And that is one of those themes that have come up multiple times in other talks. There's been enforcement through the UBO level as well, or ultimate beneficial ownership. There's been companies that have been sanctioned for human rights abuses. However, a lot of these vessels still persist, and the fleet that Katy is detailing, this distant water squid fleet, still continues to have quite large problems with forced labor, with human rights abuses, with IUU fishing, with large gaps in their tracking data, and general compliance. We've done a study looking at what we call the enablers of distant water fishing, and particularly we were looking at the squid fisheries off the coast of Latin America, so the Southwest Atlantic, and also this kind of southeastern Pacific. We've seen that about 30% of this fleet has a report of either IUU, forced labor, derogatory reporting, or large gaps in their AIS, or they've been out to sea for a year to 2 years at a time without entering port. Which is an incredibly risky endeavor, especially for the crew and the labor standards on board. If we look at it as a fleet of interest, so those vessels connected to others, we see that that number jumps to about 60%. And we often see that these fleets have multiple instances of repeat patterns of IUU or forced labor indicators there. So there's some broad enabler factors. The distant water fleet, as Katy's mentioned, is heavily subsidized by governments. The EU and China are among the top. But I'm going to detail a little bit more of the kind of direct interactions between the vessels out there with other types of vessels and their onshore actions. So So for offshore, we have kind of two types of forms of enablers. We have refrigerated cargo vessels, or I will call them reefers. They basically transship catch back to ports. They also provide provisions and sometimes crew transfers. We also have tankers. These are refueling the vessels out at sea. We see a kind of a common operating pattern amongst them where the flag of the reefers and the tankers themselves does not match the registered owner country, where the registered owner country is domiciled. We also don't see that the registered owner country overlaps with the actual ultimate beneficial ownership country. So oftentimes you might see a pattern where it's a Liberian flagged refrigerated cargo vessel that has a registered owner in the Marshall Islands, but is ultimately controlled by some company in Greece. These reefers and these tankers are also inherently risky, or some of them are. The main ones that are interacting with the distant water squid fleet have some indications of IUU connections themselves. We also have seen this large group of refueling tankers be subject to the UN Security Council investigations for oil smuggling and sanction evasion in North Korea, as well as being indicted on bribery and tax evasion. The next is a much more kind of novel form, and it's very specific to the SPRFMO or the RFMO that kind of governs the high seas or the fisheries there in the Southeast Pacific. I'm going to refer to this as a FOB, but it's a fisheries or a floating offshore fisheries base or a hospital ship, as it's been reported on by Outlaw Ocean, Manga Bay, and Artisanal. But it is a retrofitted squid jigger or squid fishing vessel that now includes a medical suite. It has a doctor and some form of security or maritime personnel from the Zhoushan province embedded onto the fleet. It has been retrofitted, and it is currently and still actively authorized as a fishing vessel within the RFMO. It is not authorized as another type of support vessel, but this is where those kind of gaps in regulations and policies isn't necessarily addressing it. So I do want to state that this isn't necessarily an illegal form at all. But for all intents and purposes, it looks and it does fish, and it kind of looks like a squid jigger that typically would be operating in this. So one good example of what the Zhepuan 98, which is one of these floating offshore fishery bases, does is it transfers crew from the squid fleet to ports when medical attention is needed. So typically where you had a vessel transiting to like a port of Callao, where it's getting medical treatment for a crew member that maybe fell ill or got injured, you now have this hospital ship that is embedded within this distant water fleet that is able to provide medical attention readily and pretty much right away as soon as they meet, and continue to provide medical care until they get to a port if necessary, or they return that crew member back on board. So the big thing with this is this isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is good that there's a somewhat a Band-Aid type solution for crew to get medical treatment out on the high seas. They kind of fill that gap that reefers and tankers couldn't provide earlier. The kind of downside to this is it's creating and further kind of extending this closed loop system within this distant water fleet where we're not seeing where these crew originated from. We can give our best estimates, like this an example here, where the Mingjang 826 and the Zhepuan 98 both transited 3 days directly towards each other. They made about a 30-minute interaction, or at least we can assume based off the AIS data, where the Zhepuan, which is the floating offshore fishery base, took the crew and immediately headed to port. We have port records that show that they disembarked, I believe, a injured crew member, where the Mingjang 826 could return back to the squid fishing grounds kind of west of the Galapagos. So again, it's a good thing that this crew was able to get medical attention. It could have been life-saving. However, the fleet at large for the Mingjang 826 has a lot of instances or accusations of forced labor within its fleet. So what you're doing is you're kind of creating this more closed-loop system where you're not seeing transparency, you're not seeing any record of where these crew came from, so there's no accountability, and we're kind of losing the clarity in the picture of what's going on within these fleet in terms of human rights. So As Katy mentioned too, eventually sometimes these vessels do have to come to port. So for instance, if the FOB wasn't able to provide the correct help in the situation, or they need maintenance, which ships do readily, that's when port agents come in. This is kind of the more onshore enabler. I know we talked about kind of port security yesterday's session, but basically port agents or maritime agents or shipping agents handle kind of all the logistics for the distant water fleet. They are the direct kind of interactions with the government agencies and the port authorities. So they're providing all of the paperwork, they're providing kind of the tracking history of the vessel, and they're kind of that liaison and conduit to all the onshore agencies there. They're very well positioned to misrepresent data, and oftentimes we've seen them be sanctioned for either misrepresenting or not fully providing all of the necessary data, although it's possible that that is actually the fault of the vessel itself. But in particular, when we're looking at this as a very kind of broad data view in the last few years, we've seen that there's one port agent in particular that handles quite frequently all the cases related to disembarking of sick, dead, or injured crew compared to a lot of other vessel agents themselves. We've seen them mismatch the reason for arrival. So if a vessel is coming in under forced arrival, we see the actual inspection reports from Produce or in SPRIFMO that it doesn't match the actual request for entry. So we see some discrepancies there. We've also seen and heard reports of other port agents involved with labor trafficking. We've also seen them signing and implementing crew contracts for crew that have been put on these distant water vessels, and they're completely bare bones, and they don't fully represent like a full sufficient contract that would be necessary for these crew to be in such high risk situations. Those crew ultimately requested emergency evacuation from these vessels based off of for issues such as not getting paid, crew conditions, and there was actually one crew member in kind of dire medical situation. So we often see these distant water squid fleets using kind of ports of least resistance in a way. We've seen trends, going from Uruguay to Peru, but because of PSMA implementation and good inspections from the authorities within these countries, we've seen them try to find other ports that maybe are a little less likely to inspect thoroughly or have different requirements, such as installing vessel monitoring systems on board. And to highlight one other instance of kind of leaving on a positive note, we've seen some great interactions between the flag states, also addressing IUU fishing more broadly. We've actually seen Panama starting to deflag based off of ultimate beneficial ownership connections. So not looking at it at that vessel by vessel level, but looking at it as that kind of more fleet and fleets of interest. But I'll stop there, and thank you all so much, and I'll pass it to Greg.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking it out. It's really a pleasure to be back here at FIU. I want to thank the Gordon Institute for Public Policy for the opportunity, for all the financial sponsors who made this possible for us actually to be in this room and to have this conversation. I really appreciate it. From my perspective, FIU has been kind of at the forefront from the academic institutions here, and Bruce didn't pay me to say this, just for the record. He did not pay me to say this. But they've been at the forefront of talking about IUU and recognizing the connection between IUU fishing and both regional security, maritime security, national security, and in bringing us into the space to be able to have that conversation. So I really do appreciate and thank Mark and Bruce for making this possible. Today I'm going to be speaking from my experiences of working with WildAid. And just real quick, for those of you who don't know who WildAid is, we're a small NGO out of San Francisco, US-based, working in 17 countries around the globe. We work at that interface of compliance and enforcement. We're working with coastal states to help them strengthen their ability to enforce their laws and their regulations. So you've already heard this today and from my fellow speakers. IUU fishing isn't just environmental. It shakes economies. It threatens food security. It enables human rights abuses and funds organized crime. Fighting it demands, sorry about that, demands collaboration across agencies and across borders. It's a core truth that cooperation multiplies our strength. Agencies working together lead to greater detection, deterrence, and prosecution. Cooperation, in my mind, means a few things: real-time information sharing, pooling of resources, leveraging common technology platforms, and the last and probably most important in my perspective is mutual trust. We know that IUU phishing networks will exploit the cracks between agencies and countries. Where there's a lack of communication, there are missed opportunities for action. Vessels are gaming the system. They're identifying those jurisdictional gaps. They're flag hopping. They're using fake paperwork. They're doing these things to make it harder, to facilitate making money. At the end of the day, vessels that are engaged in IUU fishing are not doing this to destroy the environment. They are doing it to make money. And I just want to reiterate that core fact, because sometimes it can get a little bit lost, but I think everybody recognizes that. It's important to look at, I feel kind of a little bit privileged to be the last session, because for those of you who've been sitting in the conversations on whether it be on TCOs or on money laundering, there's a common theme that I'm sure FIU loves to see and will show up in their post material about this conference, about the harmonization of laws and identifying, closing those legal, looking at those legal frameworks and closing those regulatory gaps, because where those exist is where people will find opportunities to profit. So what are some of those barriers? Those are some of those challenges. And again, I'll come back to, and I don't want to beat the dead horse or the dead tuna related to this, but the silos and information sharing. And I'll use the example of vessel monitoring systems. Most of you, if you've been around this space, and I see people, if you came to this event, the last one of the week, you probably are in this space, so you're familiar with VMS, and you're familiar with the fact that oftentimes it exists within a fisheries agency. And maybe the fisheries agency shares that information with their Navy, with their Coast Guard. Maybe they share it with their maritime police. Maybe they share it with customs. They probably don't share it with their Ministry of the Environment that has a responsibility for marine protected areas. At least in my experience, it oftentimes does not occur. One of the other challenges, and this is always the case when we talk about, I don't know a single country out there, and my background's in the United States Coast Guard, and even at the extent that the U.S. Coast Guard, as a very well-resourced agency in the global context, we were resource limited. We're always going to have that piece, and when we're talking about specifically the Western Hemisphere and a lot of our partners within the Caribbean and across Latin America, they are resource limited. They are challenged in those. So the idea of how do you make the most of what you've got? And then the last one, and I apologize, I'm going to hit this several times. I feel like my old economics professor who always stomped his foot on a question that was going to be in the final exam. Trust. Trust is just such an important piece between these agencies and being willing to actually talk to each other. So I don't want to leave it, my Coast Guard background puts me in a position where I have, as one of our old commandants used to say, he always implored us to have a bias for action, have a bias for doing something. And oftentimes in these events, we talk a lot, and I've spent a lot of time talking about the problems. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time without talking about some of the solutions and where I see opportunities. And so one of the pieces that from my perspective, I see is the facilitation of this real-time intelligence sharing. And what I mean by this is not just the VMS piece, but who gets the landing receipts when a vessel lands at port? How is that information shared with customs? How is that shared with your tax authority? How is that shared across the agencies? How is that shared with your regional partners should this be a vessel that's coming across? So we need to think about building those capabilities, and you see some of this when it comes down to like actual operational or tactical efforts. Platforms like IORIS, platforms like Sea Vision, that are trying to provide opportunities or a space for real-time information sharing within the country and with their regional partners. We spend a lot of time, there's a lot of money spent on capacity building, but I'm gonna take a slightly different spin on this. And while it's absolutely, we find ourselves in situations where we sit in rooms and we're providing training. What we are finding to be far more successful is shorter trainings and then actually operate. So we're talking to law enforcement officers, so get out on the water, go do some inspections. Let's go watch somebody offload their catch. Let's watch that catch go from the port to a restaurant. Let's make sure the paperwork's actually in line. So I would just encourage, as we think about this, how do we get from the point of, I provided you information, I provided you knowledge, into actually building, and I use, again, my Coast Guard background, the competency to be able to actually go and then enforce your rules and your laws. The next thing I'll talk on is just the harmonization of legal frameworks, and this has been stated on almost every panel. This is, it makes me feel a little bit better that it's not just a fishing problem, but it obviously is a systemic problem. So we need to find these opportunities to harmonize legal frameworks. A lot of the fisheries laws were written in the late 70s, maybe revisited in the mid-2010s timeframe. So a lot of these efforts, the systems have changed. The efforts of fishing vessels have changed, and we need to continue to adapt to that. And then the final piece I'll talk about is the technology side of the house. The Pacific Ocean is big, like really big. And if you want to find somebody out there, from my perspective, you're never going to have enough ships, you're never going to have enough planes, you're never going to have enough drones. You're just not. We're going to have to use other technologies, and those technologies typically, from what I've seen, are going to come from space. So looking at those technologies that are out there, whether that be using the freely available tools like Global Fishing Watch, Skylight, or looking at other platforms that are out there from providers that are, whether that be Windward, Starboard, and other people out there who are taking the information in and turning it into something actionable for agencies. But we got to make sure that those people have the knowledge to be able to know what they're looking at. So that would be my final piece, and I'll just close with. From Wild Aid's perspective, conservation is a team sport. We all have a role to play. We can all contribute. And Wild Aid is glad that we are provided, we appreciate the trust that we get from our coastal states that we partner with that allow us to provide insights and sometimes advice on how to move forward on addressing IUU fishing. But I would just encourage people to think about, what's your role in the team? How can you contribute to the team? We share a vision, we share a desired outcome. We want healthy communities. We want healthy fisheries. We want those industries to succeed. How can we contribute to the team that's taking that and moving that forward? With that,
Okay.
I'm going to pass it over to Gina.
Thank you. All
All right, well, good afternoon. I am the last person to talk, so we're going to make this fast so we can go to questions. So thank you, FIU, for having me here. I am grateful. I'm always grateful for the opportunity to talk about like IUU fishing and beneficial ownership. But I am going to talk about the Coalition for Fisheries Transparency, which is where I'm from now. So we are a group of over 50 civil society groups and environmental, non-governmental organizations who all have a focus on aspects of transparency in IUU fishing. So Katy talked about the three-legged stool, and the top is transparency. That's me. And if you want a definition of transparency, it's here. This is our charter. We have 10 points. So really, transparency is a little bit of anything you want it to be. We work with governments on everything from vessel tracking, seafood traceability, crew welfare, beneficial ownership, which is what I specifically focus on, rights at sea, whatever. However, we try to frame the issue of transparency in order to get more data out there, get more data in the hands of government officials in order to take bad actors off the water. We are a new organization. We were stood up, I think, in the mid-2023. Last week we had our first 3 governments commit to implementing the 10 points of the charter. Those are going to be Cameroon, South Korea, and Ghana, and they committed at the Our Ocean Conference in Busan, South Korea. So one of the things I wanted to touch on real quick is environmental NGOs and how do they work with governments and militaries. And I think one of the biggest things, because I get that question all the time, is, you know, you're an environmental NGO, you care about fish, you care about conservation. Why are you talking to me, somebody who works for the military police of a country or a Coast Guard? I did get this a lot from some folks in the U.S. Coast Guard or on the Joint Staff back in the States. Look, it's fish. I get it, but I don't care. And then they would move on to the next thing in the portfolio. And so one of the things that I like to say is NGOs were a big knowledge base. If you look at the people here at this table, I think combined all together, we have 60, 70 years of experience combined in a lot of different things. And the folks in different policy shops, in different countries, they're not oceanographers. They're not steeped in this every single day. We are. I'm not an oceanographer, but I do look at this every single day. And we've worked for years on these topics. We have convening power. We help governments build positive relationships with industry and small-scale fishers. And we help small-scale fishers understand policies and regulations, and between the two of them, like where those gaps are. And then something else we do, which is very necessary in a lot of countries, is we bridge gaps between ministries. And so Greg was talking about data not moving between ministries, data being siloed. We try to break those barriers down. Because that's really the only way that we will make concrete steps in the right direction on a challenge like IUU fishing, or a challenge like smuggling, or like the greater issue of maritime domain awareness. So I'm here today to talk specifically about beneficial ownership. Really quick, it's a very complicated topic, but the most common definition of beneficial ownership is the person or persons who have ultimate control or get ultimate profit from a company or an asset. So these are the people at the end of an ownership chain, and I want to emphasize that an ultimate beneficial owner is a person. It is a human being. There are some organizations that stop at the last company in that chain, and traditionally, we really do need to move it towards like the actual like people who like the money goes into their bank account. There is no specific worldwide definition of beneficial ownership around the country, around the world. Each company is able to set their own threshold for control or profit. The most common threshold is going to be 25%, and that is what's recommended by the Financial Action Task Force. If you were in the money laundering panel earlier today, you heard that that organization called out a lot. The FATF also recommends that countries collect this data into a central registry of beneficial ownership data, which should be made available to relevant ministries and agencies that need the data for their own purposes. So in our line of work, the coalition would recommend fisheries ministries and enforcement officials have access to that beneficial ownership data. However, we would also go a step further. We'd recommend the registry be open to the public, though only a few countries have gone that far. And so how is any of this related to IUU fishing? Companies that fish illegally or use their fishing vessel to commit non-fisheries related crimes like money laundering, tax evasion, smuggling of various goods, animals, or people, they may be more likely to hide their ultimate ownership. So that's one of the reasons that we want to look at beneficial ownership. We want to get as much data as possible to take these bad actors, like I said, off the water. Companies will hide their ownership in part also to gain access to fishing grounds that they would normally not be able to gain access to. So, for example, Argentina is a closed registry. You have to be a citizen in order to flag your fishing vessel to Argentina in order to fish in those squid-rich waters. So what some companies do is they will create a front company or a shell company or even just a normal company. They will have an Argentinian front, and then they will have other layers beyond that in order to keep their beneficial owners in their original place of operation. But they will be able to access that registry. They'll be able to have the Argentinian flagged vessels, and they'll be able to fish. Meanwhile, that fish will not necessarily be landed in Argentina, so they'll miss out on those duties, those taxes, the jobs that are created by fish being landed at port. They don't benefit from that as well. I think I heard yesterday that was five jobs are created for every one fishing vessel or something?
One fisher.
One fisher? Okay, so I mean, those are all jobs that are they're losing out. That's wages that people aren't getting. They're not putting that back into the economy. And so just overall, everything suffers. So this is, I'm going to be the first to admit, this is not 100% up to date. This, I think, is up to date as of 2022 or 2023. This is a map of countries that have beneficial ownership registries. Some countries have had, since I created this map, have put beneficial ownership regulations and registries into place, like Liberia. Some countries have put beneficial ownership registries into place and then deregulated, like the United States. And I feel they're a good target to call out because that was a long 9 years of trying to get that regulation into place, and it only lasted about 6 months. And Canada. I also want to call out Canada. Canada now has a federal beneficial ownership registry. However, each province has their own provincial registry, which has varying levels of access and control. What else do I have in here? Okay. So this is just some of the reasons why it's important to know the beneficial owner of a fishing vessel, but I'm going to move on because we're running out of time, and I do want to highlight one of the co-chairs of the coalition is Oceana. They have offices around the world. They focus on fisheries management, IUU fishing, and they commissioned a study by the Equal Sea Lab at the University Santiago de Compostela in Spain to see if they could get a good picture of the percentage of fishing vessels that are foreign-owned. So by foreign-owned, we mean vessels that are flagged and registered in one country, but beneficially owned in another. This report will be coming out, I think, at the beginning of June, and Oceana will have a policy. They'll have two policy reports coming out on the 21st of May, which will have more data, but for Latin America. So overall, the researchers looked at all the fishing vessels available in Lloyd's List Intelligence and Orbis, and they determined that only a third of the vessels that were listed in these two databases had beneficial ownership data altogether. And so that is one thing that is very important, is that most countries do not collect beneficial ownership data for their fishing vessels. They also do not collect beneficial ownership data for the fishing licenses that they issue to companies. So that's also a very important distinction to make as well. For Latin America specifically, the researchers looked at 1,726 vessels. The three countries with the most foreign ultimate ownership, so again, that is, those are vessels that are flagged in a country in Latin America, but are not owned in that same country, are Argentina at 36%, Belize at 77%, and Panama at 77%. Some other notable figures: we have a little more than 80% of the vessels in this sample are ultimately owned somewhere in the Americas, though not necessarily in the country where they're flagged. 10% of the vessels flagged to the Americas are ultimately owned in Europe. 73 of that 10%, so 73 individual vessels from that 10%, are vessels owned in Spain. Overall, the report details how these 1,726 American vessels were flagged to 33 flag states, ultimately owned by 1,155 beneficial owner companies in 72 countries. So really quickly, some positive signs. Beneficial ownership, there's a big push now from NGOs to get countries to sign on to better collection of UBO data. So Panama recently announced that they will collect and efficiently process beneficial ownership data on their distant water fishing fleet. This is very notable because, as we see in the Equal Sea data, Panama is a popular registry for these companies who want to flag to Panama but ultimately reside in another country. And then it's not a Latin America example, but Liberia recently instituted a UBO regime of their own in 2023 with a public ownership registry. So I wanted to note this because
Gina?
Liberia is an open registry similar to Panama and Belize. And thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. I think that was a fantastic overview. It's really interesting to see the kind of similar components that have popped up across all of the topics that we've been discussing over the last 2 days, such as beneficial ownership, the importance of transparency. And I know we're running late thanks to our surprise guest of the Ministry of Defense. So we have 3 minutes, I believe, for questions, thanks to the gentleman at the back. So right now I'd like to hand the microphone over to our audience if anyone has any questions for our panelists. Okay,
I guess-
do we have to go? No? Okay. I have a question. So based on this panel from the, compared to some of the others that we've seen, there's a lot of civil society represented here. So could each of you just quickly give an overview as to how you, based on your experience and the experience of your organizations, how you feel like your organizations can partner with and support government agencies to help combat the issues of IUU fishing? And we'll start with Gina and work our way back, please.
All right, so not with the coalition, but when I was with the Pew Charitable Trusts, we created a war game based on IUU fishing. It has been used here at FIU and in other organizations, and it is essentially a way to create, it's a way to create relationships between different ministries who would not normally deal with IUU fishing on a regular basis. So you would invite like the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Defense, and you'd have them play as fishers, as the Coast Guard, and over the course of a day, 2 days, 3 days, they would learn a little bit of what it's like to try to make money as a fisher, and then talk about the policies as the fish were depleted off the board, talk about the policies you can implement to try to fix some of the problems that your fishing has created.
So similarly, while it often finds ourselves in using, as Gina talked about, convening authority, we have the ability to sometimes get people in the room together. And so one of the techniques we've used is tabletop exercises. And we take that and we use a real world example. So we're walking through either a case that has happened with the country or using something that we've heard as a threat to then walk through that tabletop exercise with those agencies and bringing in defense, attorney general's office, environment, fisheries, whoever the maritime authority is for the flagging of the vessels, and having them sit in a room and work through the whole of government response to this vessel that might be fishing illegally in your waters. So that's just one example.
Thanks.
And quickly, so first I'm going to start by saying we work as a coalition called the Joint Analytical Cell. This is made up of a bunch of NGOs that work in similar but kind of niche roles: Global Fishing Watch, IMCS Network, Skylight, TrigMat Tracking, and C4ADS. But this initiative is we work directly with governments and country partners. We do this by providing capacity building and training on MCS, on MDA broadly, on platforms, tools, and technologies. We also provide actionable intelligence where we write reports jointly as the Joint Analytical Cell on either vessels of interest, but it incorporates things such as companies of interest or companies and networks surrounding them. Also the movements on the waters, satellite imagery, kind of this kind of extensive, cross kind of collaboration between different NGOs, all in one package that we deliver to government partners.
And just really quickly, so Conservation International partners with governments all over the world. We often work as a convening organization, similar to how what Gina mentioned, but we also often act as a scientific, a research, and a technical partner. And one example of that in Peru is that we're currently developing a course on international fisheries governance to be delivered in collaboration with a local Peruvian university, and that's going to be subsidized through CI and some of our funders to provide training on negotiation in regional fisheries management organizations, on some of these more like legal and technical aspects of fisheries management on the high seas in particular, that these officials who are representing Peru in these fora do not have formal education in, and so that's one way that CI is doing some direct capacity building in Peru.
Great. Well, on that note, I'm getting looks from the back, so I'd like to ask everyone to thank our panelists with a round of applause, and then if we can pick up our stuff and migrate that way, please, for Leland's closing remarks. Thank you again, everyone.